Margaret Chen's hands trembled as the cold metal handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. After 30 years of loyalty, dedication, and love poured into the Anderson household, she was being arrested for a crime she didn't commit. But as the officers prepared to lead her away, a small voice, one that had been silent for nearly a decade, shattered the tension with a single, devastating word that would change everything. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Also, let me tell you something funny. Someone actually bet that I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month, and honestly, I want to prove them wrong. So if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and join the family. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is a very personal goal for me, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you for believing in me and being part of this journey. And before you go, drop your name and location in the comments. I'd love to give you a special shout out in my next video introduction. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Anderson estate, casting golden rectangles across the Italian marble floors that Margaret Chen had polished to perfection just yesterday. She hummed softly as she arranged fresh peonies in the crystal vase on the entrance hall table, Mrs. Anderson's favorite flowers, always placed exactly 3 inches from the left edge, stems cut at precise 45-degree angles. 30 years of service had taught Margaret that details mattered in this house, that love expressed itself through consistency and care. Margaret! The voice that shattered the peaceful morning didn't belong to Elizabeth Anderson, her gentle employer of 3 decades. It belonged to Diane Anderson, James Anderson's sister-in-law, who had moved into the West Wing 6 months ago after her divorce, bringing with her an air of discontent that clung to the house like cigarette smoke. Margaret turned from the flowers, her weathered hands still gripping the pruning shears. "Yes, Mrs. Diane?" Diane descended the grand staircase with the kind of theatrical urgency that made Margaret's stomach clench. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine distress, or perhaps a masterful performance. "My jewelry box," she gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "It's been emptied. My mother's pearls, the diamond earrings James gave me for my 40th birthday, the sapphire bracelet, everything's gone." The pruning shears slipped from Margaret's fingers, clattering against the marble with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent house. "Gone? But I cleaned your room just yesterday afternoon. Everything was." "Exactly," Diane cut her off, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You were the last person in my room. You were alone with my things." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had turned to water. In 30 years, she had never taken so much as a loose button from this family. She had raised James from a teenager when his parents hired her as a live-in nanny. She had held Elizabeth's hand through 2 miscarriages before Tommy's miraculous birth. She had sacrificed her own dreams of marriage and children to pour her love into this family, and now, "Mrs. Diane, please, I would never." "James!" Diane's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "James, call the police. We have a thief in our home." The next hour unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. James Anderson appeared in the hallway, his expression torn between disbelief and dutiful concern for his sister-in-law. Elizabeth emerged from the morning room, her hand instinctively reaching for Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that Diane's sharp glare immediately cut short. And then came the police, 2 officers with notebooks and skeptical eyes, treating Margaret's protests with the kind of professional detachment that made her feel invisible. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions," the taller officer said, not unkindly, but without warmth. "Mrs. Anderson has reported approximately $2.3 million worth of jewelry missing from her bedroom." Margaret's legs nearly gave out. $2 million. The number was incomprehensible. In 30 years of service, she hadn't earned a tenth of that amount. "Officer, I've worked for this family since before Mr. James finished college. I've never stolen anything. I wouldn't know how to, I wouldn't even want to." "Then you won't mind if we search your quarters?" the second officer asked, his hand already moving toward the servants' staircase that led to Margaret's modest rooms above the garage. Shame burned through Margaret's chest, not because she had anything to hide, but because her private space, her sanctuary after long days of service, was about to be invaded. Because 30 years of trust had evaporated in a single morning. Because James wouldn't meet her eyes, and Elizabeth was crying quietly in the corner, and Diane stood with her arms crossed, radiating vindication. "Of course," Margaret whispered. "Search wherever you need to." The officers disappeared up the narrow staircase. Margaret remained in the hallway, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her shoulders. She had memorized every quirk of this house, which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck in humid weather, where the afternoon light fell at exactly 4:17 p.m. She knew that James took his coffee black with 1 sugar cube, never 2, that Elizabeth needed complete darkness to sleep, that the house settled with a particular groan at 2 a.m. when the heating system cycled off. And she knew Tommy. 10-year-old Tommy Anderson, who had entered the world 6 weeks premature, his cries weak and his future uncertain. Tommy, diagnosed with autism at age 3, who had turned Margaret's understanding of communication upside down and taught her that love didn't require words. Tommy, who would sit for hours watching Margaret fold laundry, his intense gray eyes tracking each precise movement as if memorizing a sacred ritual. Where was Tommy now? Margaret's gaze swept the hallway, searching for the small figure who was usually her shadow during morning hours. He must have heard the commotion. Loud voices terrified him, sent him retreating to his favorite corner in the library where he lined up his collection of smooth stones in patterns only he understood. Footsteps on the stairs drew Margaret's attention back to the present nightmare. The officers descended empty-handed, their expressions neutral. "Nothing in your rooms, ma'am," the tall one said. "But we'll need you to come to the station to answer some more questions." "This is ridiculous." Diane's voice cut through the air like a blade. "She's obviously hidden them somewhere else. Check the grounds, check the garage, check." "Diane." James's voice carried a warning, but it was weak, uncertain. He finally looked at Margaret, and what she saw in his eyes broke something inside her chest. After 30 years, there was doubt. "Mr. James," Margaret heard herself say, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I have served your family since you were 17 years old. I have loved you like my own son. I would sooner cut off my own hands than steal from you." For a moment, James's facade cracked, and she saw the boy she had raised, the one who had cried in her arms when his father died, who had asked her opinion before proposing to Elizabeth, who had begged her to help them with Tommy when they felt overwhelmed and lost. But then Diane placed a hand on his arm, and the moment passed. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the officer repeated, pulling handcuffs from his belt with obvious reluctance. "We have to follow protocol when valuable property." "No, no, no, no." The anguished cry tore through the house, high-pitched and raw with distress. Tommy burst from the library doorway, his small frame rigid with panic, his hands pressed over his ears, his signal that the world had become too much, too loud, too wrong. But instead of retreating to his safe corner as he usually did, he ran straight toward Margaret. "Tommy, sweetie, it's okay," Margaret began, but her voice caught as Tommy grabbed her hand with both of his, squeezing with surprising strength. His face was tilted downward, avoiding direct eye contact as always, but his whole body vibrated with urgency. "Son, step back," James said gently, moving toward them. "The officers need to." Tommy's hum rose in pitch, his grip on Margaret tightening. He began to rock back and forth, a behavior that typically signaled overwhelming anxiety. But this was different. Margaret had learned to read Tommy's movements the way others read books, and something in his desperate energy felt less like fear and more like frustration. He was trying to communicate something. "Mr. Anderson, we really need to proceed," the officer said, sympathy and duty warring in his tone. Tommy's humming grew louder, more insistent. He released one of Margaret's hands and began pulling at his father's sleeve, then pointing back toward the staircase. Not the servants' stairs, but the grand staircase that led to the family's private quarters. His finger jabbed the air repeatedly, his movements becoming more agitated with each second that the adults failed to understand. "Tommy, please, you need to calm down," Elizabeth said, stepping forward with her hands outstretched in the placating gesture that usually soothed him. But Tommy shook his head violently, his dark hair flying. Margaret's heart shattered as she watched the boy she loved struggle to bridge the gap between his inner world and theirs. She had spent years learning his language. The tap on his left knee meant he was hungry, the double blink meant yes, the particular way he arranged his stones meant he needed quiet time. But whatever he was trying to say now was beyond their established vocabulary, and the desperation in his small frame was agonizing to witness. "We need to take her now," the officer said firmly, reaching for Margaret's arm. And that's when Tommy did something he had only done 3 times in his entire life. Twice when he was in severe pain requiring emergency surgery, and once when Margaret had accidentally left him at the grocery store for 3 terrifying minutes. Tommy Anderson opened his mouth, took a shuddering breath that seemed to require every ounce of his courage, and spoke. "Show." The single word dropped into the hallway like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through every person present. Elizabeth gasped. James froze mid-step. Even Diane's carefully constructed expression of righteous anger faltered for a split second. "Tommy," Margaret whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "Tommy, sweetheart?" But Tommy didn't repeat the word. Instead, he grabbed both his father's hand and Margaret's hand, his grip fierce and determined, and began to pull them toward the staircase. His message was crystal clear. "Follow me. I'll show you. The truth is upstairs." The officers exchanged glances. James looked down at his son, then at Margaret, then at the small, trembling boy who was trying with every fiber of his being to save the woman he loved. "Maybe we should." The tall officer began. "Yes," James said hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, let's see what he wants to show us." As Tommy led them toward the stairs, Margaret felt something shift in the suffocating atmosphere of accusation. This child, who the world often underestimated, who communicated in silence and gesture, who saw and understood far more than anyone gave him credit for, he held the key to her vindication in his small, determined hands. Margaret squeezed Tommy's fingers gently, a signal they had developed over years. "I trust you." He squeezed back twice. "I love you." Whatever Tommy was about to reveal, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that truth was about to shatter the carefully constructed lie that threatened to destroy her life. The quietest voice in the Anderson house was about to speak the loudest truth. And nothing would ever be the same again. Tommy Anderson's small hand was surprisingly strong as he led the procession up the grand staircase, his grip on his father's fingers tight enough to leave marks. Margaret climbed beside him, her legs heavy with dread and hope warring in her chest, while the 2 officers followed close behind. Elizabeth trailed after them, her hand pressed to her mouth, and Diane brought up the rear with the expression of someone watching a performance she hadn't scripted. The second-floor hallway stretched before them, lined with family portraits and afternoon light that seemed too cheerful for the moment. Tommy paused at the top of the stairs, his head tilting left and right in the particular way he did when processing which direction to take. His eyes, those intense gray eyes that missed nothing, fixed on the West Wing corridor where Diane's suite was located. "Tommy, where are you taking us?" James asked gently, crouching down to his son's level, though Tommy's gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, never quite meeting his father's eyes. Instead of answering, because words were precious commodities that Tommy rationed carefully, the boy resumed his determined march down the hallway. He passed his own bedroom with its carefully organized shelves of stones and books. He passed his parents' master suite with its double doors. He stopped directly in front of Diane's room. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She had cleaned this room just yesterday afternoon, as she did every Tuesday and Friday. She had vacuumed the Persian rug, dusted the antique dresser, changed the silk pillowcases, and, yes, she had seen the jewelry box on the vanity, had even carefully moved it to dust beneath, then replaced it exactly where it had been. The box had been full yesterday. She would stake her life on it. Tommy released his father's hand and pressed both palms against Diane's door, pushing it open with a solemnity that seemed far too adult for a 10-year-old. The room beyond was exactly as Margaret had left it. Immaculate, orderly, every surface gleaming. The jewelry box sat on the vanity, its lid open to reveal empty velvet compartments, the evidence of theft that had brought Margaret's world crashing down. "We've already searched this room, son," James said softly, confusion etched in the lines of his face. "There's nothing here." But Tommy shook his head with a violence that made his whole body shudder. He made a low, urgent humming sound, not the distressed noise from earlier, but something more purposeful, more insistent. His hands began to flap at his sides, a stymieing behavior that usually meant he was processing intense emotions or trying to regulate overwhelming input. Margaret watched him with the attention she had honed over 7 years of being his primary caregiver. She knew this child better than anyone else in the world, had learned to interpret the nuances of his nonverbal communication the way linguists decode ancient languages. And right now, every signal in his body language screamed, "Pay attention. Look closer. See what I see." Tommy moved deeper into the room, his steps deliberate and careful. He approached the large walk-in closet, a space bigger than Margaret's entire quarters, and stood before it, pointing with one finger. Then he did something that made Margaret's breath catch. He looked directly at his father's face for a fraction of a second, long enough to ensure James was watching, before turning his gaze to the closet door handle. "You want us to look in the closet?" one of the officers asked, his voice carrying a note of patient indulgence that made Margaret want to scream. "Don't patronize him. He knows something you don't." Tommy nodded once, sharp and definitive, then stepped aside with an almost theatrical gesture, his version of presenting evidence. James opened the closet door, revealing rows of expensive clothes, designer shoes arranged with military precision, and built-in drawers along the back wall. "I don't see anything unusual," Diane said from the doorway, her voice tight. "Can we please stop this circus and focus on the actual theft?" But Tommy was already moving again, navigating through the hanging clothes to the built-in drawers at the back of the closet. He stopped in front of the third drawer from the top on the left side, a drawer Margaret knew contained Diane's cashmere sweaters, folded and organized by color. Tommy tapped the drawer 3 times with his knuckle, the sharp sound echoing in the suddenly tense silence. "That's just where I keep my winter sweaters," Diane said, but something had changed in her voice. A hairline crack in her confident facade. "Son, there's nothing," James began, but Margaret cut him off. "Open it," she said quietly. "Please, Mr. James. Open the drawer." There was a moment where everything seemed to balance on a knife's edge. James's hand reached for the drawer pull, hesitated, then grasped it firmly. He pulled the drawer open to reveal exactly what one would expect: perfectly folded cashmere sweaters in shades of cream, gray, and navy. Tommy made a frustrated sound low in his throat and reached past his father, his small hands diving beneath the top layer of sweaters. He pushed aside the expensive wool, digging deeper with a single-minded determination that made everyone in the room lean forward unconsciously. And then his fingers closed around something hard beneath the bottom layer of clothing. When Tommy withdrew his hand, he was holding a black velvet pouch that glittered with the unmistakable fire of diamonds in the afternoon light streaming through the closet skylight. Time seemed to stop. The velvet pouch dangled from Tommy's fingers, damning and definitive. He held it up to his father with an expression that was heartbreakingly adult. "See? I told you so. Why don't you ever listen?" "What?" James's voice was barely a whisper. He took the pouch from his son's trembling hand and opened it, spilling its contents into his palm. 3 diamond earrings tumbled out, along with a sapphire bracelet that caught the light and threw blue fire across the closet walls. That's my jewelry," Diane breathed, but her performance had lost its conviction. "In your sweater drawer," Elizabeth said from behind them, her voice flat with dawning realization. "Hidden beneath your clothes. In your private closet." Margaret felt dizzy with vindication and confusion warring in her chest. The evidence was here, had been here all along, but it made no sense. Why would Diane hide her own jewelry and then accuse Margaret of stealing it? Tommy wasn't finished. His attention had shifted to the drawer below, and he was pointing at it with the same insistence, his finger jabbing the air urgently. When James hesitated, Tommy made a keening sound that pulled at Margaret's heart, and she stepped forward. "Let me," she said softly, and opened the second drawer herself. This one held silk scarves, dozens of them, organized by color in a rainbow gradient that Margaret had created herself just last week. She carefully lifted the first layer, then the second, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through the expensive fabric until her fingers brushed against something else. More pouches, these ones larger. One by one, Margaret removed them, placing them in James's increasingly shaky hands. 5 pouches in total, each one containing pieces of the stolen jewelry, pearl necklaces, gold bracelets, diamond rings, the entire collection that Diane had reported missing. "I don't understand," James said, his voice cracking. "Diane, this is all your jewelry. It's hidden in your own closet. How is this possible unless—" The sentence hung unfinished in the air, but everyone understood its conclusion. Unless Diane had hidden it herself. Unless this was never a theft at all. "Someone must have planted them there," Diane said quickly, too quickly, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "Obviously the thief, Margaret, she must have hidden them here to frame me, to make it look like—" "Stop!" Elizabeth's voice cut through Diane's rambling with surgical precision. "Just stop, Diane." Margaret was escorted directly from the entrance hall to her quarters by the police. "She hasn't been out of sight since you made your accusation. She couldn't have planted anything." Tommy had moved to stand beside Margaret now, his hand seeking hers with the absolute trust of a child who had just performed an enormous act of courage. He pressed against her side, his face buried in her cardigan, his body trembling with the aftershocks of so much verbal communication and social interaction, things that cost him dearly in terms of emotional energy. Margaret wrapped her arm around him, feeling her own tears finally break free and stream down her weathered cheeks. "You brilliant, beautiful boy," she whispered into his hair. "You saw everything, didn't you? You always see everything." And suddenly the pieces fell into place in Margaret's mind. Tommy spent hours each day in his favorite window seat that overlooked the second-floor hallway. He was always there, a quiet presence that adults often forgot to account for because he moved through the world so silently. He watched everything with those observant eyes, processing patterns and behaviors that neurotypical people overlooked. He had seen Diane hide the jewelry. He had witnessed her plant the evidence of her own theft. And then, unable to speak freely, unable to simply tell the adults what he had observed, he had been forced to watch in horror as Margaret, his safe person, his anchor in the overwhelming world, was accused and arrested. Until he found his voice. Until love and desperation gave him the words he needed. "Officer," James said, his voice hollow with shock and betrayal, "I believe we need to have a very different conversation now." "Diane," he turned to his sister-in-law, and Margaret saw steel enter his expression for the first time that morning. "Why is your jewelry hidden in your own closet? And why did you accuse Margaret of stealing it?" Diane's face had gone through several color changes, red to white to red again. Her mouth opened and closed, her prepared lies clearly insufficient for this moment of exposure. "James, you have to understand I needed—" "Insurance fraud," one of the officers said quietly, his professional demeanor shifting from sympathetic to coldly analytical. "Report the jewelry stolen, collect the insurance payout, then find the jewelry again later. But you needed someone to blame for the theft to make it credible. And Margaret was convenient." "No." Diane's denial was shrill with panic. "No, that's not. I would never." "You would destroy an innocent woman's life and reputation for money?" Elizabeth's voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute condemnation. "Someone who has loved and served this family for 30 years? Someone who has been more of a mother to your nephew than what? Than you." Diane's desperation made her vicious. "You're so busy coddling that boy, treating him like he's made of glass, when what he really needs is someone who sees him," Margaret said quietly, interrupting Diane's vitriol. "Someone who understands that different doesn't mean less. Tommy doesn't need fixing, Mrs. Diane. He needed someone to believe him when he tried to communicate. And you," her voice broke with emotion, "you were willing to destroy me to cover your own greed." Tommy's grip on her hand tightened, and he pressed his face harder against her side. His free hand came up in one of the few signs he used regularly, the sign for love. His arms crossed over his chest. Then he pointed to Margaret, his meaning unmistakable. "I love you too, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, more tears falling. "So much." "Ma'am," the taller officer addressed Diane now, his voice formal and unyielding. "I think you need to come with us to answer some questions about insurance fraud and filing a false police report. And you," he turned to Margaret with an expression of genuine regret. "I apologize, Miss Chen. We'll need your statement, but you're free to go. There will be no charges." As the officers moved to escort a now openly weeping Diane from the room, James Anderson stood frozen in the center of his sister-in-law's closet, surrounded by scattered jewelry and shattered trust. When he finally looked at Margaret, she saw everything in his face: shame, gratitude, horror at how close he had come to losing her. "Margaret, His voice failed him. What words existed for this moment? How did one apologize for 30 years of loyalty repaid with doubt? Margaret looked at the man she had helped raise, the son she had chosen even though biology had given her none. She thought of all the years of service, the sacrifices made, the love poured out. And she thought of Tommy, still pressed against her side, who had found his voice to save her when his own father had hesitated. "We'll talk later, Mr. James," she said quietly. "Right now, I need to get Tommy somewhere quiet. He's given more of himself today than anyone should have to give." She felt Tommy nod against her side, a small movement of relief and exhaustion. Margaret gently guided him out of the closet, through the bedroom, past Elizabeth, who reached out to touch her arm, a gesture of apology and gratitude that Margaret acknowledged with a slight nod, and down the hallway toward the one place where Tommy felt completely safe, the library with its afternoon light and smooth stones waiting to be arranged in patterns only he understood. Behind them, Margaret heard Diane's protests fading as the officers led her downstairs. She heard James's broken voice asking Elizabeth how they could have failed Margaret so catastrophically. She heard the house settling around them, its familiar creaks and groans a comfort after the morning's chaos. But mostly she felt the small hand still gripping hers with absolute trust, and she knew that whatever happened next, whatever conversations and apologies and changes lay ahead, one truth had been proven beyond any doubt. Love had spoken louder than words. And truth, however silently it arrived, always found a way to be heard. The library was Tommy's sanctuary, and Margaret understood why the moment they crossed its threshold. While the rest of the Anderson mansion proclaimed wealth through marble and crystal and carefully curated antiques, this room breathed peace. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their wooden shelves worn smooth by generations of hands. The 4th wall was almost entirely glass, offering a view of the garden where autumn had painted the maple trees in shades of amber and crimson. Tommy released Margaret's hand and immediately went to his designated corner, a space the family had arranged specifically for him, with a thick cushioned mat, soft natural lighting from the window, and a low shelf that held his collection of smooth stones. He sank onto the mat with visible relief, his small body finally releasing the tension that had held him rigid during the confrontation upstairs. Margaret lowered herself into the nearby armchair, her chair, though no one had officially designated it as such. It had simply become hers through 7 years of sitting here with Tommy, reading to him, though he rarely seemed to listen, watching him arrange his stones, though she never quite understood the patterns, and offering her quiet presence during his most difficult moments. She watched now as Tommy's hands moved through his collection, selecting stones with careful deliberation. Smooth river rocks in gradations of gray. A piece of rose quartz that caught the light. A flat black stone that Elizabeth had brought back from a beach in Scotland. Each one had a story, though Tommy had never told her what those stories were. His breathing had slowed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic as his hands moved through the familiar ritual. He began to arrange the stones in a pattern that Margaret had seen before, a spiral, starting small in the center and working outward. But today, as she watched, she noticed something different. Tommy paused 3 stones into the pattern, his fingers hovering over the black Scottish stone, and then deliberately placed it outside the spiral. Separate, apart, different from the others. Margaret's breath caught as understanding dawned. "That's you, isn't it?" she said softly. "You see yourself as separate from everyone else." Tommy didn't look up, but his hands stilled for a moment, his version of acknowledgement. But you're not, Margaret continued, leaning forward in her chair. You're different, yes. But you're not less. You're not broken. You communicate in ways that the rest of us are too busy to understand. Behind them, the library door opened with a soft click. Margaret turned to see James and Elizabeth standing in the doorway, their faces marked by the morning's emotional devastation. James's eyes were red-rimmed, and Elizabeth gripped her husband's arm as if needing his support to remain standing. "May we come in?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's hands resumed their movement, placing another stone in the spiral. He didn't acknowledge his parents' presence, but he didn't show signs of distress either, his way of granting permission. James and Elizabeth entered quietly, taking seats on the small sofa opposite Margaret's chair. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft click of stone against stone as Tommy continued his pattern. "I don't know how to apologize for what almost happened today," James finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Margaret, you've been more than an employee. More than help. You've been family. And his voice broke. "I doubted you. Even for a second I doubted you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again, but she kept her gaze on Tommy, watching his small hands work their careful magic. "You were put in an impossible situation, Mr. James. Family accusing someone you trust." "No." James's interruption was firm. "No, that's not an excuse. After 30 years, after everything you've sacrificed for us, I should have known with absolute certainty that you would never betray us. Instead, I let doubt creep in. I failed you." "We both did," Elizabeth added, her own tears flowing freely now. "You left your own life behind to help us raise James when his parents struggled. You stayed when you could have pursued your own dreams, had your own family. You loved Tommy when she stopped, her hand pressing against her mouth as if to hold back a sob. "When we didn't know how," James finished quietly. "When his diagnosis came and we were terrified and overwhelmed, you were the one who researched, who learned, who figured out how to reach him. You've given him stability and love when we were too busy being afraid of doing it wrong." Tommy had stopped arranging his stones. His hands rested in his lap now, his head tilted slightly toward the conversation even though his eyes remained fixed on his spiral pattern. Margaret recognized this posture. He was listening, processing, understanding far more than anyone gave him credit for. "Your son saved me today," Margaret said softly. "He did something extraordinary, something that must have cost him terribly in terms of stress and energy. He spoke for me when I couldn't speak for myself." "How did he know?" Elizabeth whispered. "How did he know where the jewelry was hidden?" Margaret watched Tommy's profile, the afternoon light painting golden highlights in his dark hair. "He sees everything," she said. "We think because he's quiet, because he doesn't engage the way neurotypical children do, that he's not paying attention. But he's the most observant person in this house. He's always watching, always processing." "The window seat," James said suddenly, understanding dawning in his expression. "His favorite spot in the hallway. He sits there for hours every day. And that window," Elizabeth continued, following the thread, "overlooks the corridor where Diane's room is located. He must have seen her hide the jewelry. He witnessed the whole thing. But couldn't tell anyone," Margaret finished, "because speaking requires energy and courage that doesn't come easily to him. Imagine how frustrating it must have been, knowing the truth, watching me get accused, trying desperately to communicate what he'd seen." Tommy's hands moved suddenly, returning to his stone collection. He selected the black Scottish stone, the one he had placed outside the spiral, and with deliberate care, moved it to the center of the pattern. Then he took a rose quartz piece and placed it directly beside the black stone, touching. Margaret felt her throat constrict with emotion. The black stone was him. And the rose quartz, the gentle pink stone that had always been associated with her because she had found it in the garden and given it to him. That was her. Together. Connected. "Tommy," James said, and something in his voice was different, more present, more attentive. "Son, can you look at me? Just for a second?" It was a big ask. Eye contact was one of the most difficult things for Tommy, something he rationed even more carefully than words. But slowly, almost painfully, Tommy turned his head. His eyes met his father's for perhaps 3 seconds, an eternity in Tommy's world, before skittering away to focus on the middle distance. But it was enough. Enough for James to see the intelligence and awareness in his son's gaze. Enough to shatter whatever remaining misconceptions he had harbored about Tommy's understanding of the world around him. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving Margaret. Thank you for being so brave. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. I'm sorry we've underestimated you." Tommy's response was to reach for another stone, a white quartz piece that gleamed in the sunlight, and place it on his father's side of the spiral. Then a gray river rock on his mother's side. His family, represented in stone, all connected in the pattern he was creating. "We need to do better," Elizabeth said, not taking her eyes off her son. "Not just with how we treated Margaret today, but with Tommy. We've been so focused on trying to help him fit into our world that we haven't taken enough time to understand his world." "He doesn't need fixing," Margaret said, echoing her earlier words to Diane. "He needs understanding. Patience. People who are willing to learn his language instead of constantly demanding he speak theirs." "Will you teach us?" James asked, turning to Margaret. "Will you help us learn how to truly see him the way you do?" Margaret looked at the man she had helped raise, at the woman who had become like a daughter to her, and at the child who had just proven that love transcended all barriers of communication. "I've been teaching you for 7 years," she said gently. "But perhaps now you're finally ready to learn." Tommy made a soft sound, not quite a word, but something between a hum and a sigh. His hands moved through his stones again, and this time he selected a deep blue lapis lazuli piece that Margaret had never seen him use before. He held it up to the light, turning it so that it caught the sun and glowed with inner fire. Then he did something remarkable. He stood up, crossed the space between his mat and Margaret's chair, and placed the stone in her lap. His hand lingered on top of it for a moment, and when he withdrew, Margaret saw that he had left something else, a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Margaret unfolded the paper. On it, in Tommy's careful, labored handwriting, writing was almost as difficult for him as speaking, were 3 words. "Love, Miss Margaret." The tears that Margaret had been holding back finally overwhelmed her defenses. They flowed down her cheeks unchecked as she pulled Tommy into a careful embrace, mindful of his sensory sensitivities but unable to contain her emotion. "I love you too, sweet boy," she whispered into his hair. "So much. Forever." Tommy allowed the embrace for perhaps 5 seconds before gently extracting himself. His limit had been reached, his social battery depleted. But before he returned to his mat and his stones, he did one more thing. He took Margaret's hand and his father's hand and placed them together, palm to palm. Then he looked at his mother and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed all of them. "Family." The gesture said. "We are family." "Yes," James said, his voice thick with tears. "Yes, we are." The afternoon light continued to pour through the library windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Tommy returned to his spiral pattern, adding more stones with careful precision, while the 3 adults sat in companionable silence, each processing the morning's revelations in their own way. Downstairs, Margaret knew, chaos still reigned. Police reports would need to be filed. Diane would face consequences for her fraud and false accusations. The family would have to deal with the scandal, the betrayal, the broken trust. But here, in this library sanctuary, there was peace. There was truth. There was a family that had been broken and was beginning to heal, guided by the quietest and most observant member among them. Tommy placed the final stone in his spiral, a clear crystal quartz that caught the light and threw rainbows across the library ceiling. He sat back, surveying his completed pattern with satisfaction. And for the first time that day, he smiled. The weeks following what the family began calling the revelation moved with a strange duality, both glacially slow and startlingly fast. Diane was arrested and charged with insurance fraud, filing a false police report, and attempted defamation. Her lawyer entered negotiations for a plea deal while the family struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one who had been willing to destroy an innocent life for financial gain. Margaret spent those weeks mostly in the library with Tommy, who had regressed slightly in the aftermath of his extraordinary effort. He didn't speak again, and his tolerance for social interaction diminished even further as he recovered from the emotional expenditure. But Margaret understood. She sat with him, read to him, and simply existed in his space while he rebuilt his reserves through the comfort of routine and ritual. James and Elizabeth began attending family therapy sessions, including specialized consultations with autism specialists who helped them understand their son's neurodivergent perspective. Margaret attended some of these sessions, watching with quiet pride as Tommy's parents finally began to see what she had seen all along: a brilliant, observant child who experienced the world through a different lens, not a broken one. "He's been communicating with us all along," Elizabeth said during one session, tears streaming down her face. "Through his stones, his patterns, his behaviors. We were just too busy trying to make him communicate our way to notice." The therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Chen, whose shared surname had initially startled Margaret, nodded thoughtfully. "Tommy doesn't have a communication deficit. He has a communication difference. And the responsibility for bridging that gap belongs to everyone, not just to him." 3 months after the incident, on a crisp December morning, Margaret entered the kitchen to find James sitting at the breakfast table with an envelope in his hands. His expression was complex, part shame, part determination, part hope. "Margaret, please sit," he said. "I need to give you something." She poured herself a cup of tea, her morning ritual, performed in this kitchen for 30 years, and settled into the chair across from him. The kitchen had always been her favorite room in the house, with its warm sunlight and lingering scents of cinnamon and coffee. "When my father hired you," James began, his voice careful and measured, "you were supposed to be temporary. Just until my mother recovered from her surgery. But you stayed. You became permanent. And we have taken that for granted for 3 decades. He slid the envelope across the table. Margaret looked at it but didn't reach for it, her hands wrapped around the warmth of her teacup. "After what happened with Diane, I had my lawyer review your employment contract," James continued. "Do you know what I discovered? You're still being paid the same hourly rate that my father set in 1995. We've given you bonuses over the years, but your base salary hasn't increased to reflect inflation, let alone the expansion of your responsibilities when Tommy was born." Shame colored his cheeks red. "You've been criminally underpaid for decades, and we never noticed because you never complained. You never asked for more." Margaret's throat tightened. She had never thought about the money, really. She had simple needs, room and board were provided, and she had saved what she could. "Mr. James, I didn't work for you for the money." "I know," he interrupted gently. "That's what makes our failure even more egregious. Please, open the envelope." With trembling fingers, Margaret opened it. Inside was a check, a single check, for an amount that made her vision blur. $300,000. "That's an estimate of the difference between what you should have been paid and what you actually received over 30 years, James explained. "Along with interest and a calculation of overtime that you never claimed. My lawyer says it's conservative, you're probably owed more." "I can't," Margaret began, but James held up his hand. "There's more. Inside the envelope is also a new contract. Effective immediately, your salary is tripled. Full benefits, including the healthcare coverage we should have been providing all along. A retirement plan that will retroactively fund. And," his voice softened, "equity in the family trust. You're not an employee anymore, Margaret. You're family, and it's time our financial arrangements reflected that." Margaret stared at the check, at the contract, at the man across from her who had finally understood what she was worth. Not because she had demanded it, but because the crisis with Diane had forced him to examine every assumption he had made about the people in his life. "You don't have to decide now," James said. "Take time to think about it. Have your own lawyer review everything." "But Margaret," his voice broke, "please don't leave us. I know I have no right to ask that after everything that happened, but Tommy needs you. We all need you." Before Margaret could respond, The kitchen door swung open and Tommy appeared, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in the endearing way it always did in the mornings. He carried something in his hands, a tablet that the family had recently gotten him to help with communication. He walked directly to Margaret, climbed into her lap with the unself-conscious affection he only showed with her, and held up the tablet. On the screen was a message, typed with painstaking effort. "Please stay, Miss Margaret. Love you." Margaret's tears fell freely now, splashing onto Tommy's dark hair as she wrapped her arms around him. "Always, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Tommy settled against her chest with a contented sigh, his small body relaxing completely in the safety of her embrace. He held up the tablet again, showing a picture he had drawn, stick figures representing their family, with Margaret's figure in the center, surrounded by hearts. "I'll stay," Margaret said to James, looking up through her tears. "But not because of the money, though I'm grateful for it. I'll stay because this is where I belong. Because this boy needs me and I need him. Because family isn't about blood, it's about showing up, day after day, and choosing to love even when it's hard." Relief flooded James's expression. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you." The months that followed brought more changes. Diane pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to community service and restitution. She sent a letter to Margaret, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Margaret read it once and filed it away, choosing forgiveness not for Diane's sake, but for her own peace. Tommy began working with a new speech therapist who specialized in augmentative and alternative communication. He embraced the tablet as a tool for expression, typing out thoughts and observations that stunned his parents with their insight and complexity. He still didn't speak often, words remained precious and carefully rationed, but the tablet gave him a voice in a way that felt natural to him. "He's been composing poetry," Elizabeth told Margaret one evening, her voice filled with wonder. "Beautiful, profound poetry about how he sees the world. James and I had no idea the thoughts he's been having all these years." Margaret smiled, remembering the spiral patterns of stones, the careful arrangements, the silent communications she had learned to read. "He's always been telling us," she said gently. "We just learned a new way to listen." 2 years after the incident, on Margaret's 60th birthday, the family threw her a small celebration in the library, her space, Tommy's space, the heart of their home. There was cake, chocolate, Tommy's favorite, which he had specifically requested for Margaret, and gifts and laughter that filled the room with warmth. But the most precious gift came from Tommy himself. He approached Margaret with a wrapped package, his eyes still avoiding direct contact but his body language radiating excitement. Inside was a framed photograph, Margaret and Tommy, sitting together in the library, sunlight streaming through the window to illuminate them both. Tommy's hand was in Margaret's, and they were both smiling, a candid moment captured by James months earlier. Below the photo, in Tommy's careful handwriting, was an inscription. "My friend Margaret. You saw me when others looked away. You heard me when I had no words. You loved me when I couldn't say I loved you back. Thank you for teaching me that different doesn't mean less, and that the quietest voices sometimes speak the loudest truth." Margaret clutched the frame to her chest, unable to speak through her tears. Tommy stepped close and did something he rarely did anymore. Initiated a hug. She held him carefully, treasuring the gift of his affection, while James and Elizabeth watched with their own tears falling. "Speech isn't just words," Tommy typed on his tablet when he finally pulled away. "It's truth. It's love. It's choosing to see each other. You taught me that, Miss Margaret." That evening, after the celebration ended and Tommy had retreated to his room to recover from so much social interaction, Margaret sat in her quarters above the garage, her home within a home, and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared young woman who had taken a temporary nanny position 30 years ago, never imagining it would become her life's work. She thought about the baby James, the teenage James, the adult James learning to be a father to a child he didn't always understand. She thought about Elizabeth's initial fears about Tommy's diagnosis and the gradual transformation into acceptance and celebration of who he was. Most of all, she thought about Tommy, the small, silent boy who had found his voice to save her when she needed it most. The child who had taught her that communication transcended language, that love spoke through actions more than words, that truth would always find a way to be heard if people were willing to listen. On her nightstand, the framed photograph glowed in the lamplight. Margaret traced the outline of Tommy's hand in hers, remembering the desperate grip as he had led them upstairs to expose Diane's lie. She remembered his single, precious word, show. And he had shown them. Not just where the jewelry was hidden, but something far more valuable, that the people we underestimate often see the clearest truth. That loyalty and love are worth more than any material wealth. That family is defined not by blood or obligation, but by who shows up when everything is falling apart. Margaret turned off the lamp and settled into bed, feeling the weight of the check in her drawer, the security of the new contract, but most of all the warmth of Tommy's message. My friend Margaret. In 30 years of service, she had been called many things: the nanny, the housekeeper, the help, the caregiver. But friend, that was the title she treasured most. Because in the end, when accusations flew and truth hung in the balance, it wasn't the employer or the employee who had saved her. It was her friend. Her small, silent, brilliant friend who loved her enough to speak when words cost him everything. And that love, that profound, transcendent, wordless love, had proven stronger than any lie, more valuable than any jewelry, more enduring than any false accusation. Truth had prevailed. Justice had been served. And love, quiet, steady, unconditional love, had spoken louder than any voice in the room. What would you have done if you were in Margaret's position, accused after 30 years of loyalty, with everything you'd built crumbling around you? Could you have kept your composure? Could you have held on to hope? And what about Tommy, that beautiful, brilliant boy who the world so often underestimates? He found his voice to speak for someone he loved, even when it cost him everything. This story should make your blood boil and restore your faith in humanity at the same time. It reminds us that justice can prevail, even when the odds are stacked against us. It shows us that the people we overlook, the ones we assume don't understand, are often the ones who see the truth most clearly. If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry at the injustice, if it brought tears to your eyes when Tommy spoke that single word, if it reminded you that love doesn't need perfect language to be powerful, then I need you to do something right now. Smash that like button if you believe loyalty should never be repaid with false accusations. Hit that like if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or unheard. This story is for everyone who has fought for truth when lies seemed easier, for everyone who has loved someone unconditionally, and for everyone who believes that different doesn't mean less. Drop a comment below saying, "Justice served," if this story resonated with you. Tell me, have you ever witnessed someone being falsely accused? Have you ever been the one to stand up for truth when everyone else stayed silent? Share your story. This community is built on real people, real experiences, and real solidarity. Better yet, tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it when Tommy grabbed Margaret's hand? When he spoke that single word? When he led them to the truth? Or when he gave Margaret that photograph 2 years later? I read every single comment, and your stories fuel more content like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because I'm bringing you more stories like this every single week. Stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things, about justice prevailing against impossible odds, about love speaking louder than words. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a community that believes in standing up for what's right, celebrating unsung heroes, and never underestimating the power of truth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. We all know someone who's been treated unfairly, someone who's been underestimated, or someone who's fighting to be heard. Send this to them. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know that truth has a way of revealing itself, even when silence seems overwhelming. This isn't just entertainment. This is about recognizing the Margaret Chens of the world, the Tommys who see everything but are so often ignored, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. This is about building a community that says no to injustice, yes to loyalty, and always to love. So I'm asking you directly, are you with me? Are you part of this movement? If yes, prove it. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Let's make sure stories like Margaret and Tommy's get the attention they deserve. Let's make sure that loyalty, truth, and love are celebrated, not trampled. Justice served. Truth revealed. Love prevailed. Now let's spread that message everywhere. I'll see you in the next story, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Until then, remember, the quietest voices sometimes speak the loudest truth. Now go, like, comment, subscribe, and let's change the world one story at a time.